So far, we've been translating from English into monadic predicate logic by intuition. If it looks right, it was right. But a logic you can use by intuition alone is not really a logic. So here's the question. Can we write down an exact mechanical rule that decides for any string of symbols, whether it's a legal formula or just gibberish? Let's consider. Hello philosophers, I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Channel Introduction to Predicate Logic course. Back in section 2.5, we get propositional logic, a syntax. That's what we're going to do here today. By the end of this video, you'll be able to construct any well-formed formula step by step, name its main operator, find a quantifier scope, and tell a free variable from a bound one. So let's get started. Everything legal in MPL is built out of 6 types of symbols. First, we have our names. Those are the lowercase letters A, B, C, all the way through T. Then we have our variables. Those are the lowercase letters U, V, W, X, Y, Z. Then we have the predicates. Those are the capital letters A through Z. Then our 5 connectives, not, and, or, if, then, if, and only if. We have our 2 quantifiers, the upside down A and the backwards E, also known as the universal and existential quantifiers. And we have our 2 parentheses. Now you may worry, is that enough letters? What if we have just a lot of different names that we need to cover, a lot of different variables? Well, if that's the case, don't worry. All we have to do is add a subscript. So A sub 1, A sub 2, as many subscripts as we want. And then recall the logical versus non-logical symbols. The logical symbols we already know are the connectives, but now we add to that the quantifiers and the variables. The non-logical symbols would be the names and the predicates, and the parentheses are called auxiliary symbols. Before we actually get into the well-formed formulas, let's check out one tiny definition. A term is a name or a variable and nothing else. So for now, we'll just know that when you see the word term, it's just a one-word way of saying either a name or a variable. It'll get a little more interesting in later chapters, but for now, that's all we'll mean. Here is the complete recursive definition for well-formed formulas in MPL. First, we start with atomic well-formed formulas. This is where we combine a predicate with a name or a predicate with a variable. Predicate always comes first. And the way we say that is, if capital P stands for predicate, lowercase t stands for term, then capital P lowercase t is a well-formed formula. So that might be something like PA, PX, RB, GY, as long as the first letter is capital and the second letter is lowercase. Part 2 of our definition, if alpha and beta are well-formed formulas, and X is a variable, then the following are well-formed formulas. Not alpha, alpha and beta, alpha or beta, if alpha then beta, alpha if and only if beta. We've seen all those already in propositional logic, but here are the 2 new ones. For all X alpha and for some X alpha. And then part 3 of this definition, nothing else is a well-formed formula. Now let's look for a second at terminology. First, the upside down A and the backwards E are called quantifier symbols. It's only when you attach a variable to those quantifier symbols that you call it a quantifier. So the upside down A with an X, that would be a quantifier. And then if we're talking about either a connective or a quantifier, we call those logical operators or just operators. In the text, by the way, when Smith talks about these rules, he writes some symbols with an underline underneath them. So for example, if we had capital P lowercase t, and we said that capital P was just any proposition, lowercase t was any term, well, he would put underlines underneath those so that they were kind of like placeholder boxes. And you could put whatever predicate you want there for the P underline, or any name or any variable you want for the T underline. So capital P lowercase a, capital Q lowercase z. The only important thing to note about this is you have to keep things the same. So let's say you had like if PA then QA, where everything is underlined, so you can put whatever you want to in for the P's and the Q's and the A's. Well, you can do something like if RB then SB. That's totally fine. What you couldn't do is if RB then SC. Why? Because that underline A is on both sides of the arrow, so you would want that name to be the same name on both sides of the arrow, and you can't switch it up from a B to a C, for example. Okay, let's actually construct a well-formed formula. Here, our example is for some X, if fx, then GA. The first thing we want to do is to construct our atomic well-formed formulas using part 1 of our definition. So that would be fx and then GA. Then we would want to make a conditional using part 2 of that definition, specifically the conditional clause. if fx then ga. Then we'll want to put on the existential quantifier last using part 2 of that definition, specifically the existential quantifier clause. For some x, if fx then ga. Now steps 1, 2, and 3 give us what we call subformulas, the intermediate well-formed formulas of our target well-formed formula. The operator that we add last, we call that the main operator. So in this case, it was the existential quantifier for some x. Let's contrast that with this. If for some x fx, then ga. How would we build this? We'd start the same way with the atomic well-formed formulas. First the fx, then the ga. But then we would put the existential quantifier on the fx. And only then would we put the arrow. So it turns out here, the arrow is the main operator. Okay, 8.4.3.1 exercises. Here we're going to construct our well-formed formula step by step and then name the main operator. Number 1, for all x, if fx, then gx. Again, we would start with our atomic well-formed formulas, fx first, then gx, using part 1 of our definition. Then we would put them in a conditional using part 2 of our definition, the conditional clause. Then we would put the universal quantifier on last, so that would be our main operator. Number 2, for all x not gx. Again, first our atomic well-formed formula, gx. Then we would add the not on there. And only after that would we add the universal quantifier, so that's our main operator. 3, it's not the case that for some x, fx and gx. First we would make the atomic well-formed formulas. Then we would make the conjunction. Then we would add the existential quantifier. And then finally we'd add the not. So that's our main operator. Number 4, fa, and it's not the case that for some x, not fx. Again, first the atomic well-formed formulas, fa and fx. Then you'd put the not on the fx. Then the existential quantifier on the not fx. Then the not in front of that. And only at the end would you add the conjunction. So that's our main operator. Number 5, for all x, fx, and for some y, if gx, then gy. Make the atomic well-formed formulas first. Then make the conditional, add the arrow in other words. Then use the existential quantifier in front of that, put them into that conjunction, and at the very end, add the universal quantifier. Number 6, for all x, if fx, then gx, and fa. First, the atomic well-formed formulas, fx, gx, fa. Put the arrow on the fx, gx, put the universal quantifier in front of that, and then add the conjunction last. Number 7, if not fa and not fb, then for all x, not fx. First, make the fa, fb, and fx. Put nots in front of all 3 of those. Put the first 2 in a conjunction. Put the universal quantifier on the last one. And then finally, add the arrow at the end. Number 8, for all x, for all y. If fx and fy, then gx. First, fx, fy, and gx. Then add the conjunction. Then the arrow. Then the all y, and only at the very end, the all x. Number 9, for all x, if fx, then for all y, fy. First make the fx and the fy, put the universal quantifier on the fy, then add the conditional, and then at the very end, add the all x. Number 10, if for all x fx, then for all y, fy. First make the fx and the fy, then add the universal quantifiers on both of those, and at the very end, you add the conditional. Now let's talk about scope. When a quantifier is added in the middle of a construction, it's stuck onto some subformula alpha. That subformula alpha that it's stuck onto is considered the quantifier's scope. So for example, for some x, if fx, then ga, first you construct the well-formed formula if fx, then ga, and then at the very end you stick on that for some x. So that whole well-formed formula, if fx, then ga, is in the scope of that quantifier. Whereas instead, if you had if for some x fx, then ga, well in this case you're actually adding the existential quantifier just to fx, so only that part is in the scope of the quantifier. Now we say an occurrence of a variable is bound if it's stuck to a quantifier, or it's in the scope of a quantifier that has that same variable. And if it's not bound, we call it free. Some examples, the x in Rx is free because there is no quantifier. The x's in for all x Rx are both bound. The first one is bound for the first part of our definition because it's stuck to a quantifier. The second one is bound because it's within the scope of that quantifier and that quantifier is stuck with that same variable. Whereas for all y rx, well, now the x is actually in the scope of that quantifier, but that quantifier has a different variable, so it is not bound. That's a free variable. In for all x, if rx then qx, all three x's are bound. But in if for all x, rx, then qx, the third x is not bound because it's not in the scope of that quantifier. Okay, a couple of refinements. First, a variable can actually sit inside of two nested quantifiers with the same variable. For example, for all x, if px, then for some x, qx. Consider that last x. It's in the scope of that for some x, but what about the all x? It seems like it's also in that scope, right? Well, no, we don't say that it's bound by that. We say it's only bound once, and it's bound by the innermost quantifier, in this case, the sum x. Also, we say that a quantifier is vacuous if the variable that's attached to it does not occur in its scope. So for example, for all x fa, in that you don't see an x within its scope, so that for all x is vacuous. It's not doing any work. It's talking about all x's, but we're not pointing to any x's. Another one for all x fy. Now we do have a variable inside of the scope of that quantifier, but it's not the right variable. It's not an x. And then the first quantifier in for all x for some x fx. Again, that last x is only bound by the innermost quantifier, not by the all x. And by the way, before we move on, just so you know, in some logic textbooks, they don't say that the variable that's attached to the quantifier is bound. They don't say it's bound or free. So in for all x fx, that first x, they wouldn't say it was bound or free. In this textbook, we do. Also, sometimes they say that closed well-formed formulas are called sentences. But in this textbook, we're not going to do that. And what is a closed well-formed formula? A closed well-formed formula has no free variable occurrences. An open one does. Both count as well-formed formulas. However, an open one cannot be a proposition. For example, Rx. The variable x there is not pointing to anything. We're not saying for all x, it's the case that, let's say R is red. We're not saying for all things they are red. We're not saying for some things they are red. We are saying it is red. What is red? We don't know. So that can't be true or false. It's not a proposition. Okay, 8.4.5.1 exercises. We're going to determine if we have any free variables and if our well-formed formula is open or closed. Number one, tx and fx. There are no quantifiers here, so both x's are free, and this is an open well-formed formula. Number two, tx and ty. Again, no quantifiers, so the x and y are free, so this is open. 3, for some x, tx, and for some x, fx. Both the x's are in the scope of a quantifier with the same variable, so they're both bound, and this is closed. 4, for some x, tx, and for all y, fx. Well, that last x is not in the scope of a quantifier that has the same variable. The quantifier it's in the scope of has a y for a variable, not an x. So that last x is not bound, it's free, and this is open. 5, for some x, tx, and fx. The last x is not in the scope of any quantifier, so it's free, and this is open. 6, for some x, both tx and fx. Both of those latter two x's are in the scope of that quantifier, so they're bound, and this is closed. 7, for all y, for some x, ty. Now, it is the case that the innermost quantifier has a different variable than the y. However, the outermost one has the same variable, so we do consider that in the scope. So that's bound, and this is closed. 8, for some x, if for all x, tx, then for some y, fx. Now, the x on the tx is bound by the all x quantifier. The x on the fx is not, but it is bound by that outermost quantifier, the sum x. So both of these are bound, and this is closed. 9, if for some y, for all x, tx, then for some y, fx. The lattermost x is not bound by a quantifier with the same variable, so it's free, and this is open. 10, for all x, for some x, tx, and fx. The x on the tx is bound by the sum x. The x on the fx, however, is bound by the all x on the outside. They're both bound. This is closed. 11, for all x, for some x, tx, and fx. The x on the fx here is not in the scope of any quantifier, so it's free, and this is open. 12, for some x, ty. Again, the y here is not in the scope of any quantifier that has the same variable as it. So the y is free and it's open. 13, if for all x tx, then for some x fx. Everything is bound, this is closed. 13, for some x, for all y, tx or fy. Both of those x's and y's are bound, so this is closed. 15, for all x, fx, and gx. The x on the gx is not bound by any quantifier, so this is free and open. 16, if for all x, for all y, fx, then gy. The y on the gy is not in the scope of any quantifier, so it's free, and this one is open. 17, for all x, for all y, if fx, then for all x, gy. The x on the fx is in the scope of that outermost for all x. The y and the gy is in the scope of the all y, so these are both bound, and this is closed. 18, for some y, gb, and gc. Now, b and c are names, not variables. So again, they're not free or bound. So there's nothing that's free here. This is closed. 19, for some y, gy. And for all x, if fx, then gy. Now that second gy, the y there is not in the scope of any quantifier that has a y in it. So that's free and this is open. 20, for all x. It's both the case that if fx, then for some x, gx, and gx. All the x's are either bound by that sum or bound by that outside all, so they're all bound and this is closed. And that's chapter 8. We're all done. Now we have MPL fully specified. A precise symbol set, a recursive definition of well-formed formulas, main operators, scope, and the free, bound, open, closed distinctions. This makes the language rigorous. Now everything so far has been about language, about what we can say. The next chapter will flip to meanings. The semantics of MPL. So syntax means grammar, semantics means meaning. We'll define models, and finally we'll make it precise what it takes for a quantified proposition to be true or false in MPL. So subscribe and hit the notification bell to make sure you're around for chapter 9. Don't forget to like and comment. I'll see you in chapter 9. Adios.